Thank you very much for doing this interview. As I mentioned to you, this is part of Yale's project on the future of the global financial system. And I am very interested in exploring your views, particularly because of your background as having been a finance minister, and also your very significant managerial position in the World Bank, which of course is one of the primary institutions in global finance. So I thought maybe we could start with your thoughts about the recovery from the global financial crisis of 2008 and how you see the agenda, particularly for the developing world. A lot has been said, and you have given some very eloquent speeches about the broader international agenda, but I'd like to focus it really on how this impacts developing countries generally. And I realize there are different categories, and maybe we could start with sort of the most advanced developing countries, countries like China and Brazil, and then in a second category, those that are not quite as sophisticated.
Mm-hmm. Well, first, I would like to thank for this opportunity to be in your program, Jeffrey. I think it's good for us in the bank as well as for me personally to share the view of the development experience, although you look at more on a financial side. I mean, the global financial crisis 2008 really shaped the new landscape for the financial system globally. I mean, the advanced countries who suffer from this financial crisis, they do need a lot of reform within themselves. But for many developing emerging countries, I think they look at this advanced country, and the very important lesson learned from that is that no matter how high your income, it doesn't mean that you are going to be actually free from potential financial crisis. Meaning the message is that developing and managing and preventing crisis is always a priority and become always a continued effort for many policymakers, especially for developing countries who in the process of integrating themselves with the global economy, they can see the benefit of integrating to the global economy, whether on the financial side, capital side, or even on a trade and people flow. It provides them with a lot of opportunity, but also a risk. On the financial side, it's even more. And that's why for them, and this is not new at all, actually, Jeffrey, because I come from Indonesia. Indonesia have a 97, 98 ASEAN country have a financial crisis back then.
Right.
And we discussed about the right sequencing for a country to be able to integrate with the global economy, making sure that you can enjoy the benefit of this global economy, especially on the financial side, including the capital flow, but at the same time have the ability to manage the potential shock. And that will require a lot of capacity building, a policy level which is need to be also consistent, institutional, especially like supervision of the bank and financial institution, including the capital market and non-bank financial institution, as well as, of course, the improvement on the corporate governance. And if you look at the crisis in 2008, the lesson is not that different. Actually, right. It also touched the issue about the improvement on the policy level. Corporate governance is still very relevant because a lot of governance issue which leading to the excessive risk that then triggered the crisis, as well as the ability of the supervision to actually detect the vulnerability or the potential volatility within the economy, especially on the financial and capital market. I think that is the area which is for developing country, meaning that you can see that the global economy provide you with a lot of benefit, but if you are going to integrate with this system, you have to make sure that on the policy side, there is a consistency at your macro level. I think the macroeconomic policy have a lot of achievement in the past decade or two. If we talk about Africa, even in this case, the bank working many in the developing country, Latin America, Asia in general. You have what you call it, an environment in which you allow the growth to happen without creating inflation or the inconsistency on the exchange rate. So that is the more advanced on the macroeconomic framework, which is, I think, is more or less an achievement in itself. But at the micro and industrial sectoral level, I think a lot of homework still need to be done, whether this is at the policy level, regulatory framework. And now with the post-2008 crisis, there is a Basel III standard setting body who's applying a much more rigorous standard that will require more demanding for many of the developing countries to match with that. Capacity building, and then in the eliminating distortion of the policy, whether this is on a price setting, interest rate setting, exchange rate setting. Then you're talking about corporate governance, which is actually the same everywhere, whether this is on a bank ownership, on a salary, or in how you are going to proper making sure that the capital adequacy is there. So all those things, which is, I think, the most important lesson learned from this 2008, that yes, for development's sake, the World Bank in this case saying that capital market financial institution is very important for you to move forward. But the sequencing and the ability for you to reap the benefit both from the financial development as well as the global financial system is also demand your attention to the policy, to the institutional building, as well as governance.
Well, that's extremely interesting. Let me ask you just a follow-up question. When we talk about micro policies, is the bigger challenge knowing what to do, having the information, or is it the capacity? Is it the ability to execute? Or let me put it another way. There's so much discussion in international circles about, what constitutes good supervision, let's just say as an example. But is the challenge here to develop the human capital to be able to do that? Or is the challenge also having the experience? Where once you have the agenda, what's holding back more rapid progress in the developing world, in the emerging world?
Well, I happen to be actually deal with that when I was finance minister, Jeff, in this case. I mean, it's really touching the issue of both. I mean, the human capital, the regulatory, sometimes the law itself. Some of the bank supervision in some countries is not independent. They put it now become independent. Some of them actually put it in a central bank combined with the monetary policy. Like in Indonesia, they separated following the Australian case or United Kingdom. But although now UK going back to the actually different direction. But that is the question about what does it mean to have the independent supervisory body from the legal framework or for the position point of view, so that they are not going to be easily used by the politician. I think that's many countries is not yet on that position. So that is one, how to make sure that there is a regulatory and legal framework that allow them to be independent. But even if you're independent, if you don't have the capacity, there is also something that need to be built. And that's why when you call it about human capital and the ability to build the capacity of the institution is very, very important. But if you build, this is not like one-off effort, because the financial and capital market and non-bank financial institution, they are all developed, whether this is on the sophistication of the product, their behavior, and that is something that really they need to keep up with that capacity. And that is something which is really depend on from country to country. For some country, even asking for the independency of banking supervision is actually a huge political departure from what they usually have. I mean, we just discussed here in Tunisia. I talk about Ukraine, that we are now also talking about the financial sector reform. I mean, these are all talking about whether the banking sector can be independently supervised and effectively supervised, so that you can not only making sure that they are governed with a good principle and prudential principle, but they are not going to be abused either by the policymaker or the owner themselves. And then you are talking about the capacity. And then you are talking about the international standard body, which is, I think, asking you, because you are not talking about financial institution in isolation.
Right, right.
The financial institution is actually now integrated, whether at the regional level. In Asia, you have the ASEAN 10, and then they are going to have the ASEAN Economic Community. That will create quite a lot of possibility of the integration of the financial institution. And that's why the regulation supervision is no longer just talking about your own, but you also actually dealing with financial institution as a host country in which branches of many international financial institutions coming. That's also have another complexity in terms of the way you are going to supervise the banking as well as non-bank financial institution. So yes, I think regulatory, human capital, and the ability to always keep up with the standard, and the fact that financial system is not an isolated sectors.
Okay, so let's turn to the World Bank. How would you describe, or how should we think about the role of the World Bank in global finance? In these terms, what's its special competence? What does it do really well? And if you were to take a dynamic view over the next decade, where would you like to see the bank, or where is the bank moving? What is the changing picture of the bank's involvement?
Well, the bank is, of course, 70 years in the development. We are evolving. I think if from decade to decade, you will see that the ability of the bank to influence and to support many of the client country is depend on the three important power, or in this case, factors.
Right.
The first is, of course, as a bank, we are providing financial lending or even grant for many of the very low income country. So the financial side is one of the most important part of the bank. But the World Bank is not only providing lending, because we are in a development, and you mentioned previously about the capacity building and institution building. We actually provide the second element of the most important power of the bank is the knowledge.
Right.
And this is related not only the what, as you mentioned. I mean, many policymakers now, even in the developing country, in my case, I also knows very well, that they can easily actually knows about what need to be done. For example, on the budget, you need to have a healthy budget, collecting revenue, good spending, have a contained deficit. You should have a monetary policy who's not going to be like creating inflationary. That kind of thing is the what is the easier. The how is actually the most difficult part. How you are going to collect the revenue, how you are going to making sure that you are going to have a good combination of policy that will strengthening the institution, but at the same time providing room for the growth and poverty reduction to be there. And that is the knowledge part of the bank, the second power of the bank, which we, having more than 180 countries as a member and operating in more than 130 countries, we have the advantage of engaging with the client, that then we can provide knowledge, but also capturing knowledge and using this knowledge to then become the how part that then can be provide to the other country who try to do the same or to address the same issue in a development. And then the third part of the bank power is actually on a convening power. And that is the area in which, because our membership as well as our operation globally, that provide us with a very huge advantage on both the scope that we can work as well as the scale and the issue that we can actually address. I mean, we are discussing from the macro side policy up to the structural policy. We are even now looking at the issue of fragile state and conflict state. We are talking about climate change. We are discussing about the gender equality. We are talking about public-private partnership. We are talking about job creation. I think all those things is very important in achieving the two goals that the bank is actually now has been endorsed by our both shareholder and client, that is eliminating poverty and boosting shared prosperity. You are asking about what is going to be the 10 years from now. 10 years from now is not really that long, Jeff. If you talk about now 2014 is 2025 in this case. I mean, within 10 years, we are going to see the population increase globally, and especially in the developing countries, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa and some of the South Asia. We really see this as another challenge of really eliminating poverty when the population keep growing, and especially grow in the area or in the country which is actually have a much lower income. They also can provide opportunity as a demographic dividends, as a labor force. We look at the trend of urbanization. It's become the issue of the both combination of social and environmental, and that linked to also the climate change. And then we also issued the job, which is triggering the Arab Spring, or in this case, in many countries who see a very high growth rate, but not really inclusive enough so that it can be enjoyed by the bottom 40%. I think that is going to be the challenge for us as the bank to achieve these two goals, making sure that we as an institution definitely will not be adequate to work alone. And that's why partnership with many other institutions, including the client-owned country, because many of you mentioned just developing country like China, Brazil, Indonesia, Mexico, Turkey, they are becoming a growing power also in terms of their own ability. Right. So for them, it's not about borrowing the bank, it's not about the money. They engage with us is more on the how, that is the knowledge. And that is, and even in this case, addressing the issue of the disparity, or in this case, inequality. We are dealing, for example, like in Brazil, on provincial area, on the northern part, which is still lag behind. We are talking with Mexico, Chiapas, that is also another area, which is, I think it's not on the area which is more well advanced, but the region, part of the country which is still lag behind, that they cannot actually enjoy the benefit. So I guess in the 10 years, the bank will focus on these two goals. We will use our financial power, knowledge power, convening power, in order to make sure for all our clients, regardless their level of income, even the bigger country like India and China, up to the small country like Solomon Island, or even you talk about Jamaica or Caribbean island, they are all have the benefit to know, to understand, and have the support from us financially, as well as the how, that is capacity building, institutional building. And then we are going to make sure that some of the international concern, for example, like climate change, can also be addressed as a collective action.
So what I hear you saying is that the traditional functions of providing money and providing knowledge are going to be applied to an ever-growing and more complex set of issues. That whether it's urbanization or income inequality or involvement of gender, all of these are, if you went back 10 years, they would have been far less on the radar screen than they will be 10 years from now. But the function, what you actually do, and I take something else away, and just tell me if I'm right, that the knowledge function will actually grow relative to strict finance, especially for a whole group of countries that have moved up in the ladder of development. That for Turkey, just to take one example, they have access to capital markets, but you have access to knowledge that most countries themselves would never have. Do I have that right?
Well, that's exact. Yes, it is very correct. I mean, even in this case, the growing, what you call it, area of activity is related to the knowledge that our clients are willing to actually pay to get those knowledge.
Right.
Because they're no longer just borrowing. I mean, I was finance minister in this case, Jeff. I mean, for emerging market like Indonesia, I know Mexico, Turkey, they can always issue bond in the both domestic bonds market or international. But they are not going to get anything. I mean, the bondholder or the buyer in this case is signaling about whether they are pleased with our macro policy and so on. And that will reflect it in the price. But many of these countries still facing with a real of issue, structural issue, that they cannot get it through just, it is not the financial constraint. It is more on the knowledge about how to address the issue. And for example, like how you are going to increase your tax ratio, how you are going to design the tax, how you are going to reform your custom. I was in Haiti, and that is discussion about that. How you are going to address the issue of subsidy, making sure that there is a sustainability and equitably, and how you are going to design your spending on education. So it is not going to be just the hard infrastructure, but it's going to be also on the quality and the impact that can be achieved. So that kind of thing you cannot get from the financial market or capital market, both domestic and international. You get it from multilateral development bank, and the World Bank have the advantage and position because we work across client spectrum. So low-income country can actually learn from Poland, or they can learn from Brazil, they can learn from China. The South-South cooperation is becoming also the area of what you call it, the more based on knowledge rather than actually financing itself. So yes, that is the huge advantage of us. And that's why that role by the World Bank has been expected and asked by our client as well as our shareholder. Sometimes it is not about the money. I mean, we put money, sometimes not significant, but we can mobilize their own budget money, some bilateral money, even private sector, because we also work as one World Bank group. Don't forget that the World Bank also have our private arm, that is IFC, and we also have a MIGA, which is actually dealing with the guarantee. So we have a spectrum of both instrument. We have a spectrum of the client type. We also have a spectrum of the level of income of the client, so that they can actually learn from those, the scope of work that we are working.
So let's take one slice of finance. I would say long-term investment. Everyone I talk to has on his or her mind the need for more long-term investment. Everyone is asking, why is it that the world has so much liquidity, and yet, let's take like infrastructure or long-term investment in social needs, it's not forthcoming in the amounts that are going to be necessary. And this, of course, is the case in the developed world as well as developing. But if we just focus on the developing world and the emerging world and think about financing for long-term infrastructure, what is your view about the possibilities and also the constraints? What has to actually be done, and what role does the World Bank in particular play in, let's just say, long-term infrastructure development?
Mm-hmm. Well, the opportunity as well as the constraint. The opportunity is the liquidity is there, or not only liquidity, because liquidity gives the impression that this is a short-term source of funding. But even in this case, the saving mobilization by many countries is actually quite strong, especially if you look at the Asia. You see that the saving ratio is very high. They put it in the bank, that is a progress, not just holding it in the house, but putting in bank. But you see that the constraint, while there is a potential resource there, and then also private sector in which they also have the accumulated saving themselves, or government in this case. But the constraint is actually this source of funding cannot match with the need of the long-term financing for especially infrastructure. I mean, if you talk about infrastructure, whether you talk about toll, port, airport, or even power, electricity, they usually need 30 years on the financing as well as the commitment. And that cannot be matched with the source of financing, which is usually only less than 5 years, or even worse, on a saving is usually less than 2 years or 1 year. So the question is, in the constraint on the challenge, I call it, is actually having a maturity mismatch. For some developing countries, they even have the exchange rate mismatch, because the infrastructure generating revenue, whether this is on a toll road, whether this is on a power sectors or railways, they are in a local currency, while the source of financing could be coming from outside. So you have a potentially exchange risk over there. And also the constraint about the ability to prepare a project that ready to then be offered to the market to tap those source of financing, whether this is on a technical viability, financial viability, which many, I was in Indonesia, I see that we even created a certain specific institution to dedicate for preparing the project. The World Bank is actually, because we work for 70 years and infrastructure is actually one of our old traditional strength of this institution. We have a lot to offer, whether this is in terms of supporting the client in order for them to be able to prepare project, designing the public-private partnership, because many of the projects cannot stand alone as just public because the money is not going to be adequate, or stand alone a private because the private cannot also absorb all the risk. So the public-private partnership is becoming an important, but how you are going to design those public-private partnership so that it will create transparency, efficiency, there is also equitably in terms of the use and the burden of this infrastructure, that is a challenge. So in a way, the World Bank role, as we already announced by President Kim, is not only in terms of how we are going to bridge this source of financing with the needs, which is around 2 trillion every year to build the infrastructure, but also to make sure that when you are bridging these two sources of financing and the need, there is quite a lot of nitty-gritty in between. That is the preparation of the project, making them becoming like the risk is going to be addressed, and then the ability to then access those to the financial sources. I think that is the role that we here in the bank, whether through global infrastructure facility that we are initiating in the last year, as well as on our own global practice, which is related to specific sector, whether on a transport, on the power sectors, or in urbanization, or even education and health, because even on the social infrastructure, the PPP is also one thing that we can actually design, and that can be very useful for both public as well as the private.
So are you optimistic that the challenges here are going to be overcome, because almost every day some high-level official points to these massive infrastructure needs, and the numbers are quite daunting. If you just took energy and environment, alone, let alone all the urban stuff. Given what you said, a very clear identification of the problem, very clear identification of what besides finance is really key here. Do you think that we're really progressing? I mean, in other words, these infrastructure needs, if they are not met because they're so great, it seems like this is a huge potential problem building up, unless you feel that actually a lot is happening that is not, so public.
Well, no, I think it is not always, we look at the progress and people can justify by saying that the progress is not fast enough. I mean, it is not because about the availability of money, as we can see. Right, I mean, right. The progress of really on designing public-private partnership from country to country, it could be like really different, because of sometimes it is most likely is really depend on what kind of government and regulatory framework which is available on there. I mean, some government can be very progressive, and I'm now launching the PPP. India is actually quite aggressive in the past, and then they are facing with what they've already launched. It could be not really matching, and each sector, in this case, if you talk about railways, is different from power sector, it's different from toll road, it's different from port, from the airport. So you see that still a lot of learning process from many policymakers. From the private sector, they also actually still in a quite distance, in a way that the familiarity and the ability or willingness to put money in such a risky but actually very rewarding project is there. And that will require quite a lot. I mean, for the World Bank, this is one of the priority, and that's why we see that the public-private partnership, infrastructure development, that will create jobs, that will address the issue of poverty, and also create an accessibility so that address issue of the inequality is become the priority. But saying that, for us really, for even institution like the bank who's been like 70 years, we still need to build our capacity and then our ability to work together both with the government and attracting more private sector. And then not to mention that we try to link with the many of big financial institutions. I mean, a lot of actually investment bank, they are no longer doing the infrastructure financing. It's been seen as quite risky.
Right.
And that is the challenge for us to actually making sure that this is going to be connected. What is the downside to this if we are not making a progress? Huge in this case. I mean, as I said earlier, population growing, the growing middle class is demanding more better quality of life, and these are all linked to the ability to provide infrastructure for them to be able to actually enjoying the prosperity, but at the same time also realizing the potential of the people. And that is exactly the challenge that you are going to have. It have a huge political dimension, social dimension, which actually is going to like an issue for many policymakers. And the bank take this very seriously as a challenge.
So my final question has to do with the region of the world where I know where you come from. The ASEAN region, and I wonder if you could just address the question of financial cooperation within ASEAN. If one were to look at, most people when they think of ASEAN, they think of trade, but if you were to take a dynamic picture of financial cooperation among those countries, where it is and where it might be headed, this would be a very good sort of case study of financial integration on a regional basis that most people really don't know very much about. People focus on Europe, but how would you describe the extent of integration and where it's moving?
Well, this is very important question, Jeff. If we look at Asia, of course, it is known that this is the region which contributing to the growth, high performing in terms of growth is because of their export orientation, is very high investment, but they investing in especially moving from agriculture into manufacturing and services sector. Financial sector in the Asia, I think it's become infamous because of the ASEAN financial crisis, 97-98. Right. But that's provide a very, very big, lesson learned from policymakers there. I think ASEAN +3. ASEAN is 10 countries, which is actually very interesting group of countries. You have a very advanced small country like Singapore, and now Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines as the oldest ASEAN member, and then together with the other 5, whether you talk Vietnam, Brunei, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar. But this is still quite a diverse group, more than 500 million population. When we discuss about ASEAN, we usually discuss also about ASEAN +3, because the 3 important in East Asia, like Japan, South Korea, and China. So you can imagine that on a financial side, many of these countries adopting the sequencing of liberalization of the financial sectors, from first integrating their financial and capital market to the regional and the global. They are also liberalizing the policy, monetary policy, in terms of not pegging whether exchange rate or interest rate. That they have this crisis in 97-98 that provide them with a lesson about the governance, the supervision, independent of the central bank, independent of the banking supervision and non-bank financial institution. They are developing the local bond market. They are now moving into more integrated both bond as well as bank, as well as maybe capital market in a way. And that is actually the building block that they are looking. Interestingly, Jeff, if you look at the evolution, they actually look at the European Union as an example. Right. So then we have 2008 crisis. And actually, this is exactly a good lesson learned across the region. The ASEAN will look at this and saying that, okay, what went wrong and what need to be addressed for them. Don't forget this ASEAN plus 3 also establishing what we call it ASEAN Monetary Fund. This is more like the smaller IMF within the regional context. And that is also when they design those kind of ASEAN Monetary Fund, I remember that they need to do exactly like the IMF surveillance, how they are going to pull the funding, what is the governance of using the fund when the country is affected by the crisis. Like it or not, this region then have to learn from the IMF. They talk about the ASEAN Infrastructure Fund. They will look at the bank. So this region is a region who actually develop themselves, but at the same time also they integrate very strongly with the global system. They learn to take the more responsibility, and that's why that's become a very good example of how this dynamic of this region provides a lesson for others. When you look at the Japan, South Korea, China, with these 10 countries, then you look at quite a diverse. China have their own financial and capital market problem as well as strength. Japan now is also having their own reform. And the ASEAN is going to establish ASEAN Economic Community, which is actually moving beyond just trade and investment. So in a way, I guess the diversity of the ASEAN, but also their ability and willingness to learn from each other as well as to the rest of the world, especially to the Europe and the United States, provide them with quite a good opportunity to move forward. And that's why maintaining a good performance on their economy, addressing many of the structural problems which is still needed, but at the same time assuming more responsibility in the global arena, in the economic and financial leadership. And that is good for them. And I think my own personal experience having also Australia there to actually set another benchmark is also very important. So this is quite an interesting development lesson. I personally, when I'm in the bank, usually use the ASEAN as an example when I discuss with many of the policymakers. If I visited, for example, in Latin America, even in Central America, I mean, this is the country which is actually developed, quite advanced, but they are less integrated. They can learn from the other region. And usually, if they learn from the other region, it's much easier for them to actually connect. And that's why they say, oh, okay, that is actually feasible and can be adopted. I think that is the most important both opportunity for the World Bank to try to provide this kind of lesson, learn, and development experience across the globe. And that is our job here in the World Bank as a group.
Well, that's really wonderful. I think that was a great discussion, and it really gave us an understanding of the different ways that the World Bank operates and the daunting range of issues. But I want to thank you very much for your time and for your contribution.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure.
Really a pleasure.